She was every man's dream until they reached the bedroom door and found the lock no key could turn. Hello, welcome. You didn't find this by accident. These are stories of quiet courage, hidden truths, and people who chose heart over fear. If that pulls you in, please subscribe, tap the notification bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The scent of expensive lilies and stale champagne still clung to Amara's skin, a fragrant reminder of the six-figure wedding that had just concluded at the Eco Hotel. Outside, the Lagos night was a chaotic symphony of distant car horns and the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic against the bar beach shore, but inside the bridal suite, the silence was suffocating. Amara sat at the edge of the king-sized bed, her silk robe slipping off one shoulder, watching her new husband, Tund, emerge from the bathroom with the predatory confidence of a man who had finally won a long-awaited prize. She felt a cold shiver trek down her spine, not of anticipation, but of a primal, instinctive dread that had been humming in her blood for years. She had spent 26 years being the good girl, the virtuous daughter who saved herself for this very moment, yet as Tund leaned in to kiss her, her body didn't feel like a temple, it felt like a vault being prepared for a heist. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the expectation of the consummation, a word that felt like a death sentence in the back of her throat. When the moment finally came, the world didn't tilt on its axis with pleasure. It shattered with the sound of 1,000 closing doors. Amara's body, usually a vessel of grace and movement, suddenly became a suit of iron armor, her muscles clamping shut with a force that felt like a physical refusal of Tund's existence. It wasn't just a lack of lubrication or the jitters of a virgin, it was an impenetrable wall, a biological no, that resonated through her very bones. Tund's initial patience quickly dissolved into confusion, and then into a bruised, masculine ego that manifested as frustration. He tried again, his touch growing less tender and more frantic, but it was like trying to push a thread through the eye of a needle that had been welded shut. The night that was supposed to be the beginning of her life became the inauguration of her shame. As Tund finally rolled away, huffing with a mixture of exhaustion and silent accusation, Amara lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, realizing that her body was a fortress she didn't have the keys to. The divorce was finalized before the wedding flowers had even fully wilted in the Lagos heat, a scandal that rippled through their social circles like a stone dropped in a glass pond. Tund didn't use the word vaginismus. He didn't know it. Instead, he whispered the words broken, frigid, and unnatural to his friends over glasses of Hennessy at the yacht club. By the time the rainy season arrived, the vibrant, successful Amara had been rebranded in the gossip columns of the city's elite as the Untouchable bride. She walked through the corridors of her architecture firm, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes, imagining that everyone could see the invisible padlock she carried between her thighs. Her beauty, which had once been her greatest asset, now felt like a cruel joke, a shimmering bait on a hook that no fish could ever swallow. She stopped wearing the form-fitting dresses that accentuated her hips, opting instead for structured blazers and wide-legged trousers, trying to hide the femininity that had betrayed her so spectacularly on that first night. The isolation was a slow-acting poison, seeping into her weekends and her quiet evenings spent overlooking the Lekki Link Bridge. Men still approached her, how could they not? But Amara had developed a sophisticated system of sabotage, a repertoire of cold glances and sharp-tongued dismissals designed to keep them at a safe distance. She became the woman who was too busy for love, the high achiever who didn't need a man, but the truth was far more fragile. She was terrified of the moment the lights went down and the physical reality of her condition would be exposed again. She watched her friends, baby showers and anniversary posts with a detached ache, feeling like a ghost haunting the perimeter of a life she was forbidden to enter. Each failed date, each half-hearted attempt at a casual relationship that ended in the same physical stalemate, only reinforced the narrative that she was a biological anomaly. In a culture that equated womanhood with the ability to be taken and the ability to give, Amara felt like an empty vessel, a beautifully carved statue that was hollow and cold at the core. The humidity in her mother's parlor in Enugu felt different from the salt-heavy air of Lagos. It was thick with the scent of anointing oil and the stale smoke of burnt incense. Amara sat on a hard wooden stool, her knees pressed together so tightly they ached, while a self-proclaimed prophet circled her like a predator eyeing a wounded gazelle. Her mother, Mrs. Ezekwesili, stood in the corner, her face a mask of pious desperation, clutching a worn Bible as if it were a weapon against her daughter's perceived spirit husband. The prophet's voice rose in a jagged crescendo, shouting commands at the demons of blockage and the spirits of dryness that he claimed had padlocked Amara's womb and her virtue. To them, her condition wasn't a medical anomaly, it was a spiritual embargo, a curse whispered into the soil of her lineage by a jealous ancestor or a slighted rival. Amara felt a hot wave of humiliation wash over her as the prophet pressed a sweaty hand against her forehead, pushing her backward until she nearly fell, all while her mother wept and prayed for the iron gate to be broken. The absurdity of it was a sharp pain in her chest. Here she was, a woman who designed skyscrapers and managed multi-million naira budgets, being treated like a broken vessel that needed to be exorcised of its own biology. As the hours dragged on, the prayers became more frantic, a chaotic cacophony of Holy Ghost fire and rhythmic chanting that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. Amara looked at her mother and saw not a villain, but a woman trapped in a world where a female's only currency was her fertility and her accessibility to a man's desire. The realization was more crushing than the prophet's heavy hands. Her mother's love was conditional on Amara being functional, a realization that made her feel more alone than she ever had in the quietest corners of her Lagos apartment. When the session finally ended, and she was splashed with sanctified water that smelled of cheap perfume and river mud, Amara didn't feel delivered. She felt violated in a way that no physical touch could ever match. She realized then that the curse wasn't in her body, but in the expectations of a society that refused to see her as anything more than a biological machine meant for service. She left Enugu the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the prophet's shouts still echoing in her ears like a mockingbird, knowing that if she were to find a cure, it would not be found at the foot of an altar built on shame. Back in Lagos, Amara threw herself into the construction of the New Horizon Plaza, a glass and steel monolith that was intended to be the crown jewel of the Eco-Atlantic development. She became obsessed with the concept of structural integrity, the way a building could be designed to withstand the brutal pressure of the Atlantic tides while remaining impeccably beautiful on the surface. Her blueprints were masterpieces of defensive architecture. She found herself subconsciously designing spaces that were grand and inviting, but featured security systems that were nearly invisible to the naked eye. In the office, she was a ghost in a designer suit, a woman who spoke in cold, precise metrics, and refused to engage in the lunchtime banter about dating or the latest celebrity scandals at Quilox. Her colleagues respected her, but they feared her ice, unaware that the coldness was merely the insulation she used to keep her internal fires from consuming her alive. She worked until the cleaning crews arrived, finding a strange, rhythmic peace in the silence of the empty office, where the only thing expected of her was her intellect, not her body. Night after night, she would return to her apartment and stand before the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the lights of the city flicker like dying embers. She began to view her body through the lens of her profession, as a structure with a fundamental design flaw, a beautiful facade with a foundation that had been poured incorrectly. She would trace the lines of her own reflection in the glass, wondering why the mind that could calculate the load-bearing capacity of a 30-story tower could not convince its own muscles to relax. The isolation was no longer a burden. It had become her sanctuary, a controlled environment where she didn't have to perform the exhausting role of a normal woman. Yet in the quietest hours of the morning, when the city finally fell into a fitful sleep, the architect would find herself weeping over a set of blueprints for a life she didn't know how to build. She was designing homes for thousands of people, yet she remained a stranger in the only home she truly owned, the skin she lived in, which felt more like a prison with every passing day. The clinic was located in a discreet corner of Victoria Island, a place where the wealthy went to have their secrets treated with clinical indifference. Amara sat in the waiting room, her fingers tracing the edge of an old magazine, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had finally mustered the courage to see a renowned gynecologist, a man whose name was whispered in hushed tones as the miracle worker for couples struggling with conception. When she was finally called into his office, the air smelled of antiseptic and expensive cologne, a sterile environment that did nothing to soothe her nerves. She tried to explain her condition, using clinical terms she had researched in the middle of the night, her voice trembling as she described the wall that made intimacy impossible. The doctor, a man with silvering hair and a practiced air of paternalistic superiority, didn't even look up from his charts as she spoke, his pen scratching against the paper with a rhythmic, dismissive sound. He told her she was simply stressed, that she needed to relax and have a glass of wine before trying again, as if her years of agony could be solved by a vintage Merlot. The physical examination that followed was a nightmare of cold metal and clinical detachment that felt like a secondary assault on her dignity. As Amara lay on the table, her feet in the stirrups and her breath hitching in her throat, the doctor's frustration became palpable when his instruments met the same resistance that every man before him had encountered. Instead of empathy, he offered a lecture, telling her that she was tensing up on purpose and that she needed to stop being difficult if she wanted to be a real wife to any future husband. He spoke to her as if she were a disobedient child, failing to realize that the muscles he was fighting were reacting to a lifetime of unspoken fears and cultural pressures he couldn't begin to understand. When she finally left the clinic, her face burning with a mixture of rage and sorrow, she felt smaller than she had when she entered. The miracle worker had offered her nothing but the same old narrative, that the problem was her will, not her body, and that her pain was merely a symptom of her own inadequacy. Kola was a tech entrepreneur with a smile that could light up a blackout and a patience that felt, at first, like a healing balm. They met at a corporate mixer, and unlike the other men who tried to dazzle her with their bank accounts, Kola seemed genuinely interested in the way her mind worked, asking deep questions about the philosophy behind her architectural designs. For the first few months, the relationship was a dream of intellectual synergy and emotional safety. They spent hours talking in dimly lit bistros, sharing their dreams for a modern Nigeria and their mutual love for Afrobeat jazz. Amara felt a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in years, a dangerous thought that perhaps, with the right man, the gate, would simply vanish like a bad dream in the morning sun. She began to lower her guard, allowing herself to enjoy the warmth of his hand in hers, and the way he looked at her, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever encountered. But as the relationship deepened, the unspoken expectation of physical intimacy began to grow like a shadow between them, a silent countdown that Amara knew she couldn't outrun. The night it finally came to a head was meant to be a celebration of Kola's latest venture capital win, a quiet evening at his penthouse with expensive steak and a playlist of soft soul. As the music slowed and the air grew thick with intent, Amara felt the familiar coldness begin to spread from her core to her extremities, her body bracing for the inevitable conflict. Kola was gentle, his movements slow and respectful, but as soon as the transition from affection to intimacy began, the iron shutters of Amara's body slammed shut with a finality that left both of them breathless. Kola's patience, which had seemed so infinite, began to fray at the edges as he realized that this wasn't a matter of taking it slow, but an impassable barrier. He didn't yell or accuse her like Tund had, but the look of pity and bewilderment in his eyes was almost worse, a silent confirmation that even the good men eventually wanted what she couldn't give. The relationship ended not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing fade, leaving Amara more convinced than ever that she was a product with a "do not open" sign that no amount of love could remove. The breakdown didn't happen in a crowded room or during a confrontation. It happened over a simple glass of water in her kitchen 2 weeks after Kola stopped calling. Amara was standing at the counter, the moonlight casting long, jagged shadows across the marble, when the glass simply slipped from her hand and shattered into 1,000 glittering shards on the floor. She stared at the mess, her reflection distorted in the broken pieces, and suddenly the dam she had built around her emotions for years simply gave way. She didn't just cry, she wailed, a primal guttural sound that tore through the silence of the high-rise, a release of all the Holy Ghost fire, the clinical dismissals, and the failed romances. She sank to the floor, heedless of the glass that pricked at her skin, feeling the full weight of her unwantedness as a physical pressure on her lungs. She was a woman who could build cities, but couldn't inhabit her own skin, a paradox that felt like a cosmic joke played at her expense. In that moment of absolute brokenness, she realized that she could no longer live in the in-between. She either had to find a way to fix herself, or find a way to be whole without being fixed. As the sun began to rise over the Lagos Lagoon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Amara finally stopped crying and began to clean up the glass with a methodical, cold focus. The breakdown had cleared the fog of shame, leaving behind a sharp, crystalline anger, not at her body, but at the world that told her she was broken for having a protective instinct she couldn't control. She realized that she had been treating her condition like a secret sin, something to be hidden and prayed away, rather than a physiological reality that deserved a name and a treatment. She went to her laptop and began to search, not for spiritual deliverance or tips to relax, but for medical journals, pelvic floor specialists, and support groups for women who felt like they were made of stone. She found the word vaginismus again, but this time it didn't feel like a label of shame. It felt like a map, a starting point for a journey she would take on her own terms. She decided that if no man wanted her as she was, then she would learn to want herself first, and that the gate would only ever open for the woman she was becoming, not the man she was trying to please. A month later, Amara found herself driving back to her father's village in Anambra, not for a prayer session, but for a conversation with her great-aunt Nneka, a woman who had lived 90 years of silence. Nneka lived in a small house surrounded by ancient Iroko trees, her eyes milky with cataracts, but her mind as sharp as a ritual blade. As they sat on the porch drinking palm wine, Amara finally spoke the truth, her voice a whisper in the rustling leaves. "Auntie, my body is a locked room, and I am the only one without the key." Nneka didn't gasp or offer a prayer. She simply nodded, a slow, knowing movement that made Amara's heart stop. She told Amara a story of the silent women of their bloodline, women who were whispered about in the village as being cursed or too holy for men, but who were actually women whose bodies had simply said no to the violence of expectation. Nneka revealed that she, too, had lived a life of physical distance from her husband, a man who had eventually taken other wives, but had always returned to Nneka for her wisdom and her steady hand. The revelation was a tectonic shift in Amara's understanding of herself. She wasn't a freak of nature, she was part of a lineage of resistance. Nneka explained that in their culture, a woman's body was often seen as a communal resource, something to be harvested and used, and that sometimes the body's only defense was to become a fortress. "It is not a curse, my daughter," Nneka whispered, her hand dry and papery as she touched Amara's cheek. "It is a wall you built before you were even born to protect the softest parts of your soul from a world that doesn't know how to be gentle." For the first time, Amara felt a sense of pride in her own impenetrability, seeing it not as a failure of femininity, but as a radical act of self-preservation. She realized that her trauma wasn't just her own, it was the accumulated weight of generations of women who had no choice but to be taken. As she drove back to Lagos, the gate didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a sacred space that she alone had the right to govern, and the shame began to dissolve into a fierce, protective love for the girl she had been. The return to Lagos was different this time. The apartment no longer felt like a cell, but like a laboratory for her own rebirth. Amara began to curate her environment with a sensory focus, filling her space with textures that felt good against her skin, velvet cushions, silk sheets, and the cool touch of ceramic art. She spent her evenings practicing mindfulness, a concept she had once mocked as Western fluff, but which now felt like the only way to reconnect the disconnected wires between her brain and her pelvis. She would lie on the floor of her living room, the city lights reflected in the ceiling, and try to simply be in her body without the expectation of use or the fear of failure. She learned to identify the exact moment her muscles would seize, a subtle tightening in her jaw that would ripple down to her hips, and she began the slow, frustrating work of breathing through the tension. It was a lonely process, devoid of the quick fixes the world promised, but it was the first time in her life she felt she was acting as her own advocate rather than her own prosecutor. During this period of monastic living, Amara's professional life reached new heights. Her designs became more organic, more focused on the flow of light and the comfort of the inhabitant rather than just the strength of the structure. She began to speak more openly in meetings, her voice carrying a new weight of self-assuredness that came from knowing her own boundaries. She stopped checking the scene receipts on the few men who still messaged her, and she deleted the dating apps that had become digital monuments to her inadequacy. She was learning the philosophy of the void, that being empty or closed wasn't a defect, but a state of potentiality. She found joy in small things, the perfect brew of a cup of tea, the sound of a thunderstorm over the ocean, the feeling of her own strength during a morning run. She was becoming a woman who was wanted by herself, and in that newfound sovereignty, the silence of the apartment transformed from a roar of loneliness into a hum of peace. The art gallery in Victoria Island was crowded, the air thick with the smell of expensive wine and the intellectual perfume of the Lagos creative scene. Amara was standing before a large, abstract canvas that looked like a storm of gold and charcoal when a man stepped up beside her and didn't say a word for nearly 5 minutes. He was tall, with a quiet energy that seemed to push back against the frenetic noise of the room, and he wore his clothes with a relaxed indifference that Amara found strangely compelling. When he finally spoke, he didn't comment on her beauty or ask for her number. He asked, "Does it feel like a beginning or an end to you?" The question was so unexpected, so far removed from the usual scripts of Lagos flirtation, that Amara found herself actually answering him. His name was Julian, a documentary filmmaker who had spent the last decade traveling the continent, capturing stories of people who lived on the margins of the great narratives. He listened with his whole body, his eyes never leaving hers, and for the first time in a long time, Amara didn't feel the gate rattle in its hinges. Julian was a man who moved through the world with a slow-burn energy, someone who seemed more interested in the texture of a conversation than the destination of an evening. They began to see each other frequently, but the dates were unconventional: walks through the chaotic markets of Mushin, late-night coffee at 24-hour diners, and hours spent in silence at the beach watching the fishermen. Julian never pushed for more than a chaste kiss on the cheek, and he never made her feel like a prize to be won or a puzzle to be solved. He talked about his own vulnerabilities, his fears of irrelevance, and the scars he carried from a childhood spent moving between cultures. Amara found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with Kola or Tund, sharing her architectural philosophies and her love for the hidden histories of Lagos. She realized that Julian was the first man she had ever met who seemed to value the interior of her life more than the exterior of her body, and the curiosity gap he created wasn't one of tension, but of genuine, terrifying possibility. The turning point came when Julian, in the middle of a conversation about a film he was making on traditional healing, mentioned a doctor he knew who specialized in psychosomatic physical responses. Amara took the card he offered, her heart racing, and 3 days later she found herself in the office of Dr. Ifoma, a woman whose office was filled with sunlight and plants rather than cold metal and charts. Dr. Ifoma didn't ask Amara to lie on a table. She asked her to sit in a comfortable armchair and tell her story, from the wedding night to the prophet in Enugu. When Amara finished, her voice thick with unshed tears, "Doctor." Ifoma smiled, a gentle, revolutionary smile, and said the words that would change everything. "Amara, your body is not broken. It is simply trying to protect you. You have vaginismus, and it is a completely treatable condition that has nothing to do with your virtue or your worth as a woman." The relief that washed over Amara was so intense it was almost physical, a literal loosening of the invisible cords that had held her chest tight for years. "Doctor." Ifoma explained the science of it, the guarding reflex of the pelvic floor muscles, the way the brain can misinterpret intimacy as a threat, and the cycle of pain and fear that reinforces the physical barrier. She spoke about the cultural programming that tells African women their bodies are for everyone's use but their own, and how that trauma can manifest as a literal closing of the gates. For the first time, Amara was given a roadmap that didn't involve relaxing or praying. It involved dilation therapy, pelvic floor physical therapy, and a slow, intentional process of retraining her nervous system. It was a medical diagnosis, but to Amara, it felt like a spiritual liberation. She walked out of the clinic into the bright Lagos sun and felt, for the first time in a decade, that she wasn't a cursed woman or an untouchable bride. She was a woman with a medical condition that she was finally ready to face, not as a victim, but as the architect of her own healing. The therapy began with a set of medical dilators, simple, plastic tools that felt like the most intimidating objects Amara had ever seen. The first few sessions at home were a study in the physics of fear. She would sit on her bed, her breath shallow and her hands shaking, trying to convince her body that she was safe in her own room. The process was slow, agonizingly so, and there were nights when she would hurl the dilators across the room in a fit of rage, cursing the slow pace of her own progress. She had to learn to talk to her muscles, to breathe into the places where she carried the weight of her mother's prayers and Tun's accusations. She realized that her body was like one of her buildings. It had a memory of every stress and every storm it had ever endured, and she couldn't just renovate it overnight. She had to strip away the old, rusted layers of shame and replace them with new, flexible foundations of self-trust. Through this process, Amara began to understand the architecture of her own trauma. She realized that her vaginismus wasn't just about sex, it was about space, the right to say no, the right to be private, and the right to exist without being invaded. She saw how her perfectionism in the office and her ice, in social situations, were all part of the same defensive structure she had built to keep the world at bay. As she made incremental progress with the physical therapy, she found herself becoming softer in other areas of her life, more willing to admit when she was tired or when she needed help. She was learning that true strength wasn't about being impenetrable, but about being resilient, the ability to open and close on one's own terms. The physics of fear were being replaced by the physics of flow, and as the gate began to feel less like iron and more like muscle, Amara realized that she was finally building a home she could actually live in. The time came when Amara knew she had to tell Julian the truth. The relationship was reaching a point where taking it slow would soon feel like holding back. They were sitting on the balcony of her apartment, the city of Lagos, a carpet of twinkling lights below them, when she finally found the words she had been rehearsing for weeks. She told him everything, the vaginismus, the therapy, the years of feeling like a broken woman, and the fact that intimacy might always look different for her. She waited for the look of pity, the "it's not you, it's me" speech, or the subtle withdrawal she had seen in every other man's eyes. But Julian simply took her hand, his thumb tracing the lines of her palm, and said, "Amara, I didn't fall in love with your accessibility. I fell in love with you. If the gate is closed, we stay outside and build a garden there. If it opens on your time, not mine." The weight that lifted from her shoulders in that moment was so immense she felt she might float away into the Lagos night. Julian's acceptance was the final piece of the healing puzzle, a confirmation that a man's wanting didn't have to be a conquest. They spent the next few months redefining what intimacy meant for them, long nights of talking, the low-stakes touch of a massage, and the deep, emotional vulnerability of sharing their darkest fears. Julian became her partner in the therapy, not as a participant, but as a cheerleader, never pressuring her and always celebrating the small victories of her progress. He showed her that wanting someone could be a gentle, enduring hum rather than a violent, demanding roar. For the first time, Amara felt wanted, not for what she could provide, but for the interiority of her soul, and in that safety, the gate began to lose its power over her heart. The physical therapy was working, but the dilation of the soul was a much more complex process. Amara had to confront the ghosts of her past, the wedding night, the prophet, and the dismissive doctor, and systematically strip them of their power. She began a ritual of reclaiming her body, taking long baths with oils that made her feel luxurious, and buying lingerie that was meant only for her own eyes, a way of proving that her femininity belonged to her first. She started a journal where she wrote letters to the parts of her that were afraid, thanking them for protecting her for so long, but telling them they could finally stand down. She was learning that healing wasn't a linear path, but a spiral. She would have days of incredible progress followed by days of regression, but each time she fell, she landed on a higher floor of self-understanding. Her relationship with Julian flourished in this non-physical space, proving that a deep, romantic connection could be built on a foundation of emotional safety and shared values. They became a team against the world's expectations, a modern Lagos couple who refused to follow the traditional scripts of conquest and submission. Amara found herself becoming more empathetic toward other women, realizing that everyone carried gates of their own secrets, shames, and traumas that they kept locked away for fear of being unwanted. She began to mentor younger women at her firm, not just in architecture, but in self-sovereignty, teaching them that their worth was never something that could be taken or given by anyone else. The dilation was no longer just about a physical opening, it was about the expansion of her capacity to love, to lead, and to live without the shadow of shame. The final hurdle was her mother, Mrs. Ezekwesili came to Lagos for a visit, her suitcase filled with more blessed oils and a new list of power-packed prayer meetings. As they sat at dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to why Amara was still alone and when she would fix the problem that had caused her divorce. Amara looked at her mother, a woman she loved but who represented everything she had been fighting against, and decided that the silence had to end. She told her mother, clearly and without anger, about vaginismus, the therapy, and the fact that she was finally happy. "I am not cursed, Mama. Amara said, her voice steady and resonant in the quiet restaurant, "and I am not broken. My body did what it had to do to survive a world that didn't ask for my consent. I am healing, but I am healing for me, not for a husband and not for your prayers." The look on her mother's face was one of profound shock, a collision between decades of tradition and the radical truth of her daughter's experience. For the first time, Mrs. Ezekwesili didn't have a prayer or a Holy Ghost command to offer. She simply sat in the silence, her eyes welling with tears, as she realized the depth of the pain her daughter had carried alone. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was a crack in the old wall of superstition and shame. Amara's mother didn't apologize, but she didn't mention the prophet again, and when she left for Enugu, she hugged Amara with a new kind of tenderness, a hug that recognized her as a whole person, not just a failed vessel. The confrontation was Amara's final act of structural renovation, a tearing down of the old, crumbling pillars of her family's expectations to make room for the life she was actually living. Just when Amara felt she was on the verge of a breakthrough, a sudden, unexpected panic attack during a quiet moment of intimacy with Julian sent her spiraling back into the shell. It was a reminder that trauma has a long tail and that the body's memory is deeper than the mind's resolve. For a week, Amara retreated into the coldness, refusing Julian's calls and convinced that the healing had been a lie she told herself to feel normal. She felt like the untouchable bride all over again, a woman who was destined to be a closed book forever. The frustration was a physical weight, a sense of failure that threatened to undo all the work she had done in therapy and in her soul. She looked at the dilators and felt only a cold, sharp hatred for the fact that she had to work for something that seemed so easy for everyone else. It was Julian who brought her back, not with a grand gesture, but with a simple note left at her door. "The gate is allowed to close when it's raining, Amara. I'm still here with my umbrella." The note was the key she didn't know she needed, the permission to fail, the permission to be closed, and the permission to be imperfect. She realized that healing wasn't about being cured once and for all. It was about the resilience to keep trying even after a relapse. She went back to Dr. Ifoma, who helped her see the panic not as a setback, but as a clearing of the last remnants of fear. Amara learned that her body was like the Lagos tides. It would have its highs and its lows, and that the goal wasn't to control the water, but to learn how to swim. She reached out to Julian, and together they navigated the rainy season of her recovery, proving that a relationship built on patience could survive even the most impenetrable storms. Amara and Julian began to explore a philosophy of touch that had nothing to do with penetration or performance. They focused on sensate focus, a technique Dr. Ifoma had suggested that involved exploring each other's bodies with the curiosity of a child and the reverence of an artist. They learned the map of each other's pleasure, the curve of a neck, the softness of a palm, the rhythmic pulse of a heartbeat. This new language of intimacy was far more profound than anything Amara had experienced or imagined. It was a communion of souls that didn't require entry to be valid. Amara realized that the world's obsession with the act was a narrow, impoverished view of what it meant for two people to be one. In this space, the gate became irrelevant. Amara's body began to respond not out of duty or expectation, but out of genuine, uncoerced desire. She felt a melting that had nothing to do with her muscles and everything to do with her safety. She was learning that sexuality was a spectrum, and that she was the one who got to define where she stood on it. Julian's steady, undemanding presence was the constant in her variable life, a man who truly wanted her for the entirety of her being, including the parts that were still guarded. The philosophy of touch became the blueprint for their life together, a life built on consent, curiosity, and the slow burn of a love that didn't need to conquer to be complete. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Amara decided to hold her own deliverance session. She took her old marriage certificates, the shame clothes she had worn during her divorce, and the blessed oils from Enugu, and she drove to a secluded spot on the Tarkwa Bay beach. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, she built a small fire in the sand, the flames licking at the dry driftwood. One by one, she threw the tokens of her shame into the fire, watching as the paper curled and the fabric blackened into ash. She wasn't praying to a prophet-esque God. She was speaking to her own soul, a declaration of independence from every man who had tried to take her and every woman who had tried to fix her. "I am the gatekeeper," she whispered into the wind, her voice lost in the roar of the Atlantic. I decide when to open, and I decide when to stay closed. I am not a curse. I am a woman. As the last of the embers died out, Amara felt a sense of lightness she had never known, a literal breaking of the psychological vessel that had held her captive. She wasn't waiting for a miracle anymore. She was the miracle. She drove back to the city with the windows down, the warm Lagos air filling her lungs, feeling like a woman who had finally won her own life. The curse was gone, not because a prophet had shouted it away, but because Amara had finally seen herself through eyes of compassion and strength. The first victory didn't happen in a moment of passion. It happened in a moment of surrender. One evening, while lying in Julian's arms in the quiet of her apartment, Amara felt a shift in her body, a sudden, profound opening that felt like a flower blooming in slow motion. It wasn't the result of trying or pushing. It was the result of letting go. For the first time, her body didn't see Julian's touch as a threat, but as a welcome. The physical barrier that had defined her life for a decade simply dissolved, replaced by a fluidity that left her breathless and weeping with joy. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't the fireworks of a romance novel, but it was real, and it was hers. Julian's reaction was one of quiet, tearful awe. He didn't celebrate it as a conquest, but as a gift they had built together. The victory wasn't just physical, it was the final proof that her body was on her side and that she could trust herself again. They spent the night in a new kind of closeness, a quiet victory that felt like the first day of the rest of her life. Amara realized that the gate had never been a wall to keep people out. It had been a safety valve that stayed closed until it was finally, truly safe to open. She woke up the next morning and looked in the mirror, and for the first time in 10 years she didn't see a broken woman. She saw a woman who was complete, wanted, and whole. The New Horizon Plaza was completed on schedule, a shimmering monument to modern African architecture that became a symbol of the city's resilience and beauty. At the grand opening, Amara stood before a crowd of Lagos's elite, her voice steady and her presence commanding, the untouchable bride, now the architect of the future. She looked out at the faces, the people who had whispered about her, the men who had failed her, and her mother, who was watching with a look of genuine pride. Beside her stood Julian, his hand a steady weight on the small of her back, a man who had wanted her when she felt unwantable, and who had stayed through the silence and the storms. The story of the woman no man wanted had a new ending, one that wasn't about a man unlocking a woman, but about a woman unlocking herself. Amara and Julian had built their own architecture of intimacy, a relationship that was as strong and as flexible as one of her buildings. The gate was no longer a focal point. It was just a part of the house, something that opened and closed in rhythm with her own heart. As they walked out of the plaza and into the vibrant, chaotic beauty of the Lagos night, Amara knew that she was no longer a closed book. She was a living, breathing story of resilience, a woman who had discovered that the most important wanting of all was the wanting of her own soul. The ivory gate was finally and beautifully unlocked. Amara's gate is finally open, but the shadows of Lagos hold many more secrets. Have you ever carried a burden the world refused to understand? Drop your story in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a chronicle. This is Tales and Shadows, where the truth hides in plain sight.